his own denomination. In other words, he's well-read, well-rounded, and well-grounded. He's also the author of an edited volume called Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth, a resource for congregations on sexual orientation and gender identity, and the author of Queer Lessons for Churches on the Straight and Narrow, which I believe you can purchase on the other side of the curtain after the presentation tonight. Cody is first and foremost a person with conviction and commitment, wisdom and integrity, and he has incredible gifts of intellect and passion. He integrates his thinking, his lived experiences, and his faith in ways that make me sometimes sit and think and wonder and question and rethink what I've already thought. I'm glad that you've been at Brite as my teacher, and I'm looking forward to hearing you tonight as our speaker. Thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure and privilege to be here, and I thank Steve and Joretta for inviting me, and for the Alliance of Baptists for forming me and really bringing me here on behalf of the Alliance. It's not everywhere that I feel like I'm coming home, and I do feel like that here. So I thank you for making me feel welcome. I remember the first Sunday of my first job as a youth minister in a small Southern Baptist church in rural North Carolina. 19 years old and so eager to get started in ministry, I arrived early on that first Sunday morning, and I was greeted at the door with the news that the mother of 2 teenagers in my new youth group had been found murdered in the woods nearby our church the night before. The 2 youth, her children, were waiting for me upstairs. I really did not know what to do, and they didn't know what to do either. They just showed up at a place where they knew there'd be folks to be with them in their shock and in their grief. And 3 years later, in the last weeks of this same job, before I moved away to seminary in Atlanta, the pastor went on vacation, and I was left to handle pastoral emergencies as they might develop. Since my first day on the job, it had been a fairly uneventful 3 years as far as pastoral emergencies go, so I wasn't too concerned about it. And this week was fairly uneventful too, until Friday, when a 5-year-old child in our small town drowned in a neighbor's pool. And the family was new in town and didn't belong to our church, but on Saturday, without a church of their own, they asked to hold the boys' memorial service in our sanctuary because some members of our congregation lived nearby them and came to be with them in the midst of their unthinkable tragedy. They were taking his body back to their home state for burial the next day, so we pulled together a service that Saturday afternoon with only a few hours' notice. Our pastor, long gone and still a few days from returning, I was called upon to officiate the service that I would first have to plan that Saturday afternoon. It was a sacred pastoral responsibility I had never had before, and still stands as one of the most meaningful moments I've ever had in ministry. And you have your stories too. Stories that illustrate so clearly the way so many people's lives are still tethered to the community of a local congregation, despite what the statistics on church closures and denominational decline suggest. Your story suggests something about why, in the wake of such personal tragedy, people still show up at church. For many of you as Divinity school students and local pastors and parishioners, your stories, like my own, animate your movement toward the risk of following this precarious vocational pathway into ministry, despite the fact that the statistics on church closures and denominational decline suggest that perhaps you should develop some other professional interests. These are important stories about community cultivated within local congregations. They need to be told as we all try to figure out together how we're going to continue practicing Christian community in an era when it has become difficult to be church. The great Kentucky poet and farmer, Wendell Berry, says that in all our attempts to renew or correct ourselves, to shake off despair and to have hope, our starting place is always and only our experience. We can begin, and we must always be beginning, only where our history has so far brought us, with what we have done. Nearly as early as I can remember, the starting place of my experience is rooted in a love for the church. I was nurtured and raised by church people. I experienced my sense of call to vocation and ministry within the local church in Duncan, South Carolina. The beauty of music from choirs and the organ lured me to come closer to the Baptist tradition in which I was raised. We would go on family vacations and we'd all get to choose on our particular day what we did that day. And if we were in a place like Charleston, South Carolina, my day would be going to all the churches in Charleston that I had researched. They had big pipe organs, and seeing them and sometimes sneaking in and play them and things of this nature. And my father and grandfather facilitated my fixation on all things ecclesial by succumbing to my persistent begging and finally building a church for me in our backyard when I was 6 years old, complete with a white cross-topped steeple and a stained glass window that we rescued from storage in our own Baptist church's congregation. It had been in the basement, and it was just cracked in a few places, but it was perfect. It bathed this makeshift altar that I had, made of an old wooden office desk with light of pale blue and purple, and decked out in my tiny robe and ministerial stole that my grandmother sewed for me. My other grandfather and I would play church for hours in the backyard, and sometimes, involving the neighbor children many times a week. Very active congregation. And as much as working on concerns of affirmation and inclusion and justice for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people has come to shape my sense of vocation and animate my writing and scholarship in recent years, my history is rooted in a love for the church. So it is understandably confusing to me when I am confronted with a rendition of where our history has brought us in sexuality and faith dialogues that sets up a strong dichotomy between LGBTQ people and Christian communities, as if these are distinct groups only now beginning to come into contact with one another. It makes me think that there are other stories that need a good telling. Because, as wise old Wendell Berry says, in all our attempts to renew or correct ourselves, to shake off despair and to have hope, our starting place is always and only our experience. And just as my experience is as closely tied to the church as it can be, rooted in a love for the local congregation, so too the history of our dialogues on sexuality and Christian faith, about the place of LGBTQ people within the life of local congregations, that conversation too is rooted in a love for the church. There are stories that need to be told. Because a long time before Stonewall, there was a church. Not to diminish the importance of that fateful day in New York at the Stonewall Inn when riots over unjust treatment by the police sparked the gay rights movement, but before that day, there was a church. It all started with about a half dozen gay members of a Catholic parish who approached the altar week after week after week to partake in those ancient symbols of the kingdom of God, bread and cup. But the priest, who had heard their private confessions, refused to serve the sacramental elements to gay members of the parish, and denied them participation in the Eucharist week after week, leaving them standing at the altar rail, cut off from the table of the Lord. Of course, this was not the first time queer Christians were barred from receiving the elements of communion and the sustenance of community by guardians of the ecclesial status quo, but this time, the excluded mounted an audacious response. Renting space in a hotel lounge with a makeshift altar constructed from cocktail tables, reminds me of my own little makeshift desk altar, a small group of faithful formed a new congregation under the pastoral leadership of George Hyde. They eventually took the name the Eucharistic Catholic Church, a reminder of the sacrament once but never again denied them. And if you think that this took place in the 1960s in a place like San Francisco or New York City, you'd be dead wrong about that. This story, the founding of the first congregation by lesbian and gay Christians in faithful defiance of those intent upon their perpetual exclusion, took place in 1946 in Atlanta, Georgia, the heart of the American South. And in 1946, Atlanta, this church began as a racially integrated congregation comprised of gay and straight members from multiple denominations. Before Stonewall, there was a church. Decades later, another gay minister with a history of anguished soul-searching and at times outright despair, a spiritual experience common to so many saints in the Christian tradition, came to understand his struggle over sexuality and faith no longer as the burden he had been led to believe, but as a vocation, a call to shepherd a ministry with gays and lesbians marginalized by their faith communities. Troy Perry, a Pentecostal minister, gathered 12 people in the living room of his Los Angeles home in October 1968 for the first service of worship for what would grow to become the Metropolitan Community Church. And the first building ever owned by a gay organization wasn't a community center or a recreation complex or an office building for lobbyists or a facility for activists. It was a church. The first building ever owned by a gay organization was the permanent sanctuary built by the Metropolitan Community Church in the early 1970s. The MCC quickly grew to become the largest LGBT grassroots organization in history. And while the majority of early MCC members came from mainline Protestant churches, a quarter were Roman Catholic. Others joined from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And still others joined in a friends category of membership that included Jews and agnostics and atheists and Buddhists who could not align themselves with the historic tenets of Christian faith, but who were woven into the fabric of this remarkably expansive community of welcome and grace. Before Stonewall, there was a church where our history is rooted. While the MCC provided a new alternative space for worship outside the established exclusionary churches, another group began to work within their tradition to open space for the queer faithful to worship more freely, a group known as Divinity. Soon emerged as the first effort of LGBT organizations within any particular tradition. In this case, the tradition was none other than the Roman Catholic Church. Dignity groups met on Saturdays instead of Sundays, so that members could continue worshiping in their local parishes, while still partaking in the theological discussion and the mutual support and the celebrations of Mass offered in the Dignity gatherings. Its founder, Father Patrick X. Nydorf, was eventually barred by his superiors from continuing his ministry with gay Catholics, turning the leadership of the organization over to its many lay members who continue their work to this very day. If our starting place is always and only our experience, then our experience at the intersection of LGBTQ lives and Christian faith is just about as closely tethered to the church as it can be. And of course, you have your stories too. Stories of the faithfulness and courage of LGBTQ people in your congregations, in your communities, in your denomination, who persistently face the guardians and gatekeepers of the ecclesial status quo and work toward the impossible. People whose stories need to be told. And the more mundane but no less meaningful stories of LGBTQ folks who just grow up nurtured by good church folk. Maybe playing church in their backyards and going off to seminary because despite what the statistics suggest, they are lured by a call to lives of ministerial service within the local congregations they love so much. We have to question these all too common rhetorical dichotomies between LGBTQ people and Christian communities, as if these are distinct groups only now beginning to come into contact with one another. There are other stories that need to be told. But it's not just a matter of getting our story straight, so to speak. It's not about telling stories more truthfully or more accurately. It's also a matter of becoming clear on just what we are talking about in the first place. In an era when it is difficult being a church, what we're talking about is our attempt to, as Barry says, renew or correct ourselves, to shake off despair and to have hope. And, as Barry says, this is a conversation we must always be beginning. What we're talking about in the first place isn't where the boundaries should be drawn, but about just what kind of community we are called to be. And if we're going to reframe the discussions on LGBTQ people and congregations in this way, we will need new strategies for dialogue. We have, for too long, been preoccupied with moving our boundaries around, guided by a strategy for dialogue that is now worn out. It needs to be retired. Because the kinds of questions we ask and the methods that we develop to pursue our quest for truth inevitably shape the kind of community we will become. We're not talking just about asking questions around sexuality and faith. We are cultivating communities through our dialogues. And we must always be attentive to just what kind of communities we are called to cultivate. But as I said, there's a problem with the stories we tell about LGBTQ people in churches. And the problem stems primarily, I think, from the types of questions we've become accustomed to asking about LGBTQ people in Christian faith. Our traditional posture, what we're used to, what we're accustomed to, what we are continually induced into around dialogue concerning queer people and Christian faith has been a strategy or a posture of suspicious scrutiny. Christian communities have long been suspicious toward various forms of human difference, whether race or gender or class or gender identity or sexual orientation or religious affiliation. We have perfected a suspicious gaze toward those who differ from the social or congregational norm. These suspicious questions typically go something like this. Can someone be both gay and a faithful Christian? How should congregations respond to gay people? Should we allow gays and lesbians access to church membership or leadership positions or ordination? Are gay people excluded from the covenant of marriage based on their same-gender loving status? A posture of suspicious scrutiny guides many ways of investigating the questions we ask about LGBTQ people. Some turn to the scriptures and ask, what does the Bible say about homosexuality? Others turn to historical precedent and ask, can it be any other way? Scientific sources are another avenue by which we inquire, how did they get that way? By choice or by nature? All of these strategies continue to avert our gaze away from the lived human realities of the subjects of inquiry. And instead, they bolster our suspicion with sources that can be used to talk about those subjects, but to never talk with those subjects. Questions formed out of suspicion toward human difference do produce certain results, but these outcomes typically take the shape of boundary maintenance. For example, can someone be both gay and a faithful Christian? If the answer arrived upon is no, then we shore up the boundaries around church membership or ordination or Christian marriage, etc. And we keep those who don't fit the norm out. If the answer to the question is yes, then we shift the boundaries outward a bit to include more people into these institutions and structures. Let some of them in. If we're still unsure, then we just agree that these are the boundaries we have for now, probably for good reason, and if they need to change, someone else will have to change them. Maybe the next generation, we say. I was reminded of this recently in the wake of this World Vision saga that got so much publicity recently. If you're not familiar with the story, World Vision is a large evangelical-leaning organization with the mission of providing food and water and other basic necessities of life to the world's poorest children. And a couple of weeks ago, the executive director of World Vision announced in a Christianity Today story that World Vision would open its employment to married gay and lesbian people. Whereas previously the policy excluded LGBTQ people from being considered for employment. So this wasn't because the board of directors studied the situation and changed their theological position on same-sex marriage. It was, as the executive director described it, an act of Christian unity to defer to churches and denominations on the theological questions surrounding sexuality and to practice a more expansive hiring policy that recognizes the diversity of theological opinion within varied faith communities. And all of this came amid a lot of changes in the evangelical world. I don't know if this is a world you pay attention to, but it's certainly in the media a good bit these days. It was just 9 months ago that Exodus International, the leading evangelical organization charged with the erasure of LGBTQ identities through a quasi-psychotherapeutic gay cure, closed its doors and apologized for the damage it has produced in the lives of so many LGBTQ people. I have a stack of books on my shelf right now that I'm supposed to be reviewing for a bibliography project that HRC will put up on their website in the next coming month or so for a layperson to access literature on LGBTQ and faith questions. And this stack of books is filled with books written by evangelical pastors who are writing now books offering affirming perspectives on LGBTQ people. And some of them are really good books. I mean, so as you might imagine, many evangelical leaders were quite beside themselves about World Vision's decision. Reportedly, millions of dollars in support for World Vision's work was pulled overnight. Thousands of children losing their longtime sponsors. Denominational leaders encouraged their members to withdraw support from the organization, and within 48 hours, World Vision reversed its decision and re-implemented its hiring policy excluding gay and lesbian people. What is so interesting to me about this World Vision saga is not that they reversed their decision on the hiring policy after so much vocal criticism and punitive financial measures from its siblings in the evangelical world, and you can hardly blame them for reversing the decision when 84.7% of their budget that they were losing overnight, just disappearing. 84.7% of that money goes directly to programming costs for food and water, clean water, and basic living necessities for the poorest children in the world. What is interesting to me about this is that they subverted the traditional strategy of suspicious scrutiny and boundary maintenance. And they simply decided to stop policing certain boundaries anymore, at least for 48 hours. The criticism this drew from their companions in the wider evangelical world, and even their decision to revert back to an exclusionary hiring policy, really isn't too much of a surprise, even if it was very hurtful to watch. But the decision to stop policing boundaries, not for any intentional, deliberative theological movement toward LGBTQ affirmation, but for the sake of Christian unity, intrigues me. I think it is a foreshadowing of what we might begin to see in other evangelical circles, especially as the anxiety over the toll evangelical rancor over LGBTQ issues is taking on the willingness of young adults to give these churches a chance anymore. As I read numerous op-ed and pieces and even the chatter on social media after the World Vision saga, I noticed a very common rhetorical move employed to criticize the evangelical hostility against LGBTQ people that draws on this fear of church closure and denominational decline that has become so prevalent. It goes something like this. Young people are leaving the church over the Christians' attitudes toward LGBTQ people, and we've got to recognize our mistake of exclusion and open our doors to LGBTQ people. That's sort of my rendition of the way these arguments have gone. Some evangelicals invoke the statistical findings of the Barna Group from just a couple of years back that found churches' attitudes about sexuality as the primary reason why millennials are leaving churches. But one problem with this type of argument is the reality that many mainline churches and denominations that have become open to and affirming of LGBTQ people in recent years are also in decline and seem no more attractive to millennials than their exclusionary counterparts in a lot of ways. But at very least, we may be putting an end to this fearful myth I used to hear so often that if our congregation becomes welcoming and affirming, that we will be flooded with LGBTQ people and become a gay church. I think folks eventually figured out that queer people like going to church about as much as straight people do, which unfortunately isn't very much right now. But the World Vision saga does, to my mind, at least point to a dissatisfaction with our typical strategies of suspicious scrutiny and boundary maintenance. The notion that if we faithfully figure out where to draw the lines of inclusion or exclusion, we will have done our due diligence on the matter of LGBTQ people in Christian churches. This strategy has taken a toll on us. And it's not that questions of inclusion aren't important. There's obviously a lot at stake in these questions for LGBTQ people. At times, these questions have led to the opening of inclusive spaces that provide a type of breathing room for LGBTQ people who desire to practice their faith without scrutiny, to follow their callings without hindrance, to wed their partners with joy, and to live their lives in safety. But we simply cannot rest satisfied when we have settled the questions of inclusion. Because in the end, they are unimaginative questions with very little life beyond the answer. They don't move our hearts, only our boundaries. They don't provoke our theological imagination, only the rearrangement of our theological beliefs. Too often they fail to get us moving in creative directions, only serving to get us stuck in a morass of conflicting views. So I want to suggest that this strategy of suspicious scrutiny is quickly becoming worn out. It is time for us to ask some new questions. Suspicious scrutiny has allowed us to talk about LGBTQ people without actually talking with LGBTQ people. It so often serves to dehumanize by making people into objects of inquiry that we can investigate at a distance with the tools of biblical scholarship or scientific study, rather than calling us into relationship with others. Seeing in the other something of the quality that makes us human. Suspicious scrutiny focuses a great deal of our attention upon boundary maintenance, but does little to help us consider just what kind of communities we are in the process of becoming. So for churches considering a new posture toward LGBTQ people in their midst, I want to suggest that we begin to shed our suspicious scrutiny toward LGBTQ people, and that we learn to adopt a posture of compassionate curiosity toward LGBTQ people. As a new way forward, in this dialogue, as a way of opening space for relational involvement in dialogue with others and not simply about others. There's a world of difference between suspicion and compassion, between scrutiny and curiosity. While suspicion places us in opposition to those we are investigating, compassion places us in human relation with them. While a posture of scrutiny emerges from a place of anxiety and fear in the face of the LGBTQ other, curiosity emerges from a human-to-human desire to learn from and to learn with the LGBTQ other. Questions of suspicious scrutiny too often serve to maintain boundaries and support the status quo, while questions of compassionate curiosity move us toward mutual learning and growth with those who differ from us, searching together for ways of promoting human flourishing. So these are the type of questions I ask in the book, Queer Lessons for Churches on the Straight and Narrow. And some of those questions go like this. What have LGBTQ people learned about the formation of relationships at the margins of church and society that we would all benefit from knowing? And at a time when the formation of intimate bonds and covenanted relationships, which is something churches are concerned about, is so precarious. And straight people really don't have a good track record with this whole thing either. What might we learn from looking at the lives of LGBTQ people who for 20, 30, 40 years have been in an intimate partnership with another person, despite the fact that they had no church community to bless that, no legal structures to protect them and bind them in legal ways, and oftentimes no family to say, we love you and your partner. What can we learn from how they were able to form these intimate bonds at the margins? What can congregations learn from the example of LGBTQ people who have cultivated community at the margins of church and society, even amid widespread rejection from so many of their families and communities? In a time when it is really difficult to be a church, when we are struggling to figure out how we're going to maintain, and more importantly, how we are going to promote the flourishing of our communities of faith, both congregations and denominations, what might LGBTQ lives have to teach us when no communal structure, no institutional structure facilitated the connection of LGBTQ communities? There were no rule books, no instruction manuals that had to be created, cultivated at the margins. And then another example, what can we learn from the examples of LGBTQ people who maintain strong faith commitments amid the widespread rejection by churches? I mean, if you Barna statistics and all of the other, I'm flooded constantly with charts and graphs and statistics in my email inbox about the decline of the churches. This stuff is stuff we need to take seriously. And we really are concerned about the faith commitments of our community members? What might we learn from people like George Hyde and Troy Perry and Patrick Nydorf and all of the other people whose names you don't know, but whose faces you might know in your own communities, who have maintained strong and robust faith commitments amid widespread rejection by the faith communities in their own backyards. And while congregations stand to gain a great deal by turning our attention toward questions formed out of compassionate curiosity toward human difference, questions formed by a concern for what kind of community we are called to become, rather than where we should draw the boundaries of inclusion or exclusion, if this congregational posture is to be meaningful, LGBTQ people have some responsibility in this matter as well. Queer people, I think, have to adopt a different posture in these dialogues. We've been put on the defense for so long that is a very easy posture to take in these conversations. When we've had to for our own survival in a lot of ways. But we should be asking at this point, are we content to simply belong and assimilate into the ecclesiastical status quo? Or will we insist that our lives and our experiences and our collective history have something significant to offer our faith community? For decades now, we've been objects of inquiry, our bodies placed in ecclesiastical petri dishes and subject to the poking and the prodding of suspicious scrutiny. And we became skillful biblical interpreters and courageous prophets and reformers in the church and in the denominations that we love, with some great success in recent years, helping them to shift toward greater inclusivity and practices of justice. But now, I wonder, how will we make it into the future when we live in an era when it has become difficult to be the church, when communities of faith are changing, but not often changing fast enough, as we've seen in recent weeks? When we are at a place of making subtle shifts in policy, like World Vision, without recognizing that our practices up to that point have wreaked havoc in the lives of LGBTQ people. Rarely is there an apology. My suggestion this evening is that we explore what it would mean for collectives of LGBTQ people to practice forgiveness as a movement toward justice. Forgiveness doesn't allow for a process of smooth assimilation and a systemic forgetting of the wrong that has been done to us. Enacting forgiveness insists that there are lessons to learn for all of us and the possibility of a future that we must struggle to live into together. The first time I explored this notion of forgiveness publicly with a group of Christian religious professionals, I talked for an hour and a half about the violence done to LGBTQ people through the anti-LGBTQ messages of religious groups, and I mused about the potential for acts of forgiveness to bring this wrongdoing to light in ways that outright condemnation never will. And suddenly one of the workshop attendees from another denominational tradition that condemns LGBTQ people suddenly seemed to just sort of get the point of the workshop. He said in a very perturbed tone, "Wait a minute. My church believes homosexuality is a sin and that gay people need God's forgiveness. But it seems like you're saying that we are the ones that need to be forgiven." Always nice to know you're getting your message across. Even if it takes a minute. The last time I spoke about the subject of LGBTQ forgiveness toward churches, someone wrote an op-ed in their Baptist State newspaper asking, quote, "Is there wisdom in believing that mature college students can actually benefit from the musings of an individual who has committed his life to distorting Scripture, disobeying the Savior, and denying the sinfulness of his own behavior?" End quote. So mixed reviews on this forgiveness. Many LGBTQ people see the prospect of practicing forgiveness toward justice as an impossibility, and understandably so. Their bodies have been so deeply wounded, their psyches and their souls have been attacked for so long that it is really almost unthinkable. And this is quite understandable. And in order to practice forgiveness in any meaningful way in these circumstances, there's a lot of cultural baggage about forgiveness that we must get past if this is to be a meaningful response in any way. So we've tended to think of forgiveness as forgetting, such that all the memory of wrongdoing is erased by the act of forgiveness. We've tended to think of forgiveness as personal therapy, whereby we're simply seeking to form some inner healing by forgiving those who have wronged us. We've tended to think of forgiveness as saccharine sweet piety, by which we acquiesce to the message of the gospel by saying some pious words, but harboring hatred in our hearts. The Southerners are really good at this. But I want to set these understandings aside to consider the possibilities of forgiveness as a method for bringing about a more compassionate and just relation to one another. Forgiveness that isn't simply individual, but is practiced collectively by LGBTQ people who can share in the experience of forgiving those who have inflicted deep harm. This is a forgiveness that is in recognition that we must be able to forge ahead together in ways that cultivate a more just and less violent society for all, and that helps us to face the humanity of one another, even those we've presumed are our enemies. So if LGBTQ people began experimenting with forgiveness toward churches, here are a few ways that I think we need to reconceive forgiveness in order to make it a method to bring about justice. So briefly, if forgiveness toward justice says, we recognize that you did very wrong. In our day-to-day interactions, we hear numerous apologies from families and friends and co-workers, and often these are just for small slights or mistakes that are barely noticeable, and to which we respond, no problem, just forget about it. But forgiveness is not forgetting, despite what cultural wisdom suggests. To the churches that have perpetuated and perpetrated outright lies about LGBTQ people, or cause us to exist in excruciating silence about our lives and those we love, we will never be able to say, oh, no problem, forget about it. Enacting forgiveness requires that we openly recognize that a serious wrong has taken place, that there are real victims whose well-being has been put in jeopardy. Forgiveness as a method to bring about justice is most certainly not forgetting. Secondly, forgiveness toward justice says, your wrongdoing has caused irreparable damage and thus cannot be simply ignored. If it were a simple slight, we'd hardly need to expend the energy to discuss the meaning of forgiveness. We could just move on with our lives with a no harm, no foul attitude. But for the history of Christian negativity toward LGBTQ lives, we are dealing with a complex wrongdoing that not only affects individual lives, but weaves a web of marginalization and violence throughout our society in which we are all caught. The threads of which no LGBTQ person can ignore or escape. Influencing parents to disown their children. Inspiring violence against LGBTQ people by portraying us as despicable or diseased or disordered or despised. Forgiveness, more than shrugging it off, forgetting it, or acknowledging the apology without any further action, stands with the perpetrator. In this case, we're talking about institutions, churches. Whether or not they have yet acknowledged their wrongdoing, in open and vocal recognition of the fact that the wrongdoing in question must be taken very seriously by all parties involved. Thirdly, if forgiveness toward justice says, we will not hold your wrongdoing against you forever. This is the hardest one. But it also seems to be the crux of forgiveness. Because while forgiveness isn't forgetting and it refuses to hide the scars caused by a perpetrator's wrongdoing, it also cannot forever insist upon casting the perpetrator in light of the church's collective past. Forgiveness allows room for churches to actually change and opens the space necessary for the cultivation of that change. Forgiveness must be enacted with the hope that the perpetrator will change, even if it seems like a hope against hope, an impossibility. Forgiveness is a method for cultivating justice, is neither sentimental nor pious, and it also recognizes that change is difficult and requires the support and accountability of those who cannot forget the complex wrongdoing leveled against them, but who commit to creating space for the perpetrator, churches in this case, to live life differently, moving into a more just future together with LGBTQ people. Finally, forgiveness toward justice says, we will work with you to cultivate a better future for us all. If through a process of forgiveness, LGBTQ people can openly and publicly acknowledge with individuals and faith communities who have perpetrated injustice and acted out of disdain for our lives, that yes, you did wrong. And the wrong was a complex wrongdoing that has caused irreparable damage that your words can never mend. And if we can make the difficult commitment not to hold this wrongdoing against them into perpetuity, then comes the hard work. Forgiveness as a tool for justice will position many of us in closer proximity to those with whom we once worked at cross purposes. Now, hope against all hope on a parallel trajectory toward justice and peace and the common good, toward the types of communities we believe we are called to become. While we cannot forget the past and are committed to holding perpetrators accountable, never to return to past wrongdoing, a process of forgiveness invites a working together toward a more hopeful and more just future. If churches are going to do more than maintain a set of boundaries, we must begin cultivating a posture toward the embodiment of human difference, shaped not by suspicion, but by compassion. Questions formed not out of an attitude of scrutiny, but by an attitude of curiosity and an eagerness to learn from the life and experience of the other. Lessons that stand to profoundly shape the community we are ever in the process of becoming. And if LGBTQ people are going to strive toward more than simple assimilation into an ecclesial status quo, if we are genuinely concerned with the cultivation of faith communities that we love so much, we must not be content to simply assimilate. Instead, we must insist that our lives and experiences and collective history have something significant to offer our faith communities, because the kinds of questions we ask and the methods of inquiry we pursue inevitably shape the type of community we will become. We are not just talking about asking questions around sexuality and faith. We are struggling together toward a future for our churches. As Barry says, in all our attempts to renew or correct ourselves, to shake off despair and to have hope, our starting place is always and only our experience. And for so many of us, our experience is profoundly shaped by a love for churches. Thank you. I don't know exactly how long you expected to stay here, so if you need to go, that's perfectly fine. I've really enjoyed the time thus far, but I would really enjoy some time for some conversation and dialogue if you want to stick around for that. And so we're recording this, and it's being live streamed. So if you have a question, I would ask that you come to this microphone, or this one over here too.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll pull it a little closer, so that we can hear the question on the webcast. I don't think your face will be shown,
Right.
but
I'll
your voice.
bring you the mic if you'd like.
So you can come to this microphone, or he can bring you that one. Or you might have a basketball game you want to go.
I don't know really what I'm going to say, but I feel really moved to speak. I do interim pastorates. And I often go into churches that other people don't want to waste their time with, or whatever, that have fought or, dwindled down to be just very small numbers. And in those experiences, I'm often so empowered by the people who have stayed, because they do have the kind of love that you're talking about. And not just LGBT, but just that love that goes all the way around. But one that changed me, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago or whatever, was a congregation that had a pastor who welcomed a funeral into the congregation when people wouldn't even let a funeral happen at the funeral homes because of AIDS. And they called her, because she was the woman they hadn't spoken to. They called every male pastor in town who said, no, we won't do that funeral. And she said, I'd be happy to do that funeral. I'd love to do that funeral, but I have one condition. And it's that it will be in the church, not in the funeral home. And so she had a few days before the funeral was going to happen. One of them was a Sunday. And on Sunday morning, she stood in the pulpit and she said, I had this call, and nobody else would take this funeral. And most of the people in the congregation at that time that she'd gone to, it was an old inner city church with a building that was, falling down around Victoria. They're struggling to survive, and they're in their 80s on walkers and everything else. But she said, I want you here tomorrow, so get a good night's sleep tonight, and bring your cookies and bring all of your stuff that you do. Because we're going to welcome these people, and we're going to live the gospel that we pronounce in the pulpit every Sunday morning. So they got there early, and they stood on their walkers, and they welcomed the people who began to come in. And the funeral was for a guy who'd been a biker, and he had a pretty rough-looking crew with the hair things and the skull cap, all kinds of the jewelry and hats and all kinds of things. And this was a few years back when this was not as common in the U.S. And so when they walked in, the people that they encountered were these loving 85-year-olds who loved the church and loved every person and wanted to welcome them. And they brought them in, but they found out that it wasn't just the bikers who showed up, but when they mentioned that a church had said, well, we'll have this funeral, but it has to be at the church, the parents, the sisters, the cousins, the aunts, the uncles, all these other people, the church building was full. And the people came and had boxes of Kleenex, and they were passing them around, and their cookies and all this other stuff. But the love that happened there, when Barbara, pronounced the gospel of God's love for everyone, no matter what, and buried this young man, changed that whole congregation. And it became an open and affirming congregation in a city where there weren't very many, and began to grow like crazy. And then she left, and there was a pastor afterwards that had kind of a blaming pulpit, and so things fell apart again. And I went back in when there were 40 people left. But most of them were, the 80-year-olds had died by then. There was most of these new people who'd come in. gay and lesbian, one transgender. And I met the people who loved. Most of them had been in therapy most of their lives trying to figure out their identities, and they were great with people, but I've never been in a group that was more open towards diversity. I was sitting there when you were asking your questions, I was writing what I'd learned. I don't know, maybe I could pull up my list, but inclusion and that curiosity, that great love for the people, the acceptance of the diversity in a way that I've never experienced it in congregations, a lot of different congregations that I've been in. Courage. These people would go out on the street at night and bring in young people. We lived in a neighborhood where, the church was in a neighborhood where a huge number, it was a safe place in downtown, and it was where all the kids who were being thrown out by their parents would come, and some of them prostituting themselves to stay alive, living on corners, getting involved with drugs, all kinds of things. But they would go out and try to bring these people, and we partnered with the Mental Health Association that was across the street to try to get people off of the drugs. And there was some of them had flipped into a bipolar from the stress, and we got them on meds that would help them adjust their lives. But I've never seen the kind of depth of commitment to people, because these people love the church and believe that they had enormous reservoirs of strength. And even if it was a scary, scary, scary situation, it was like they were the most courageous people in the world, little tiny, tiny people, but just with huge, big souls, And so I love them, and I learned so much from them, and what you're speaking about, I can't make sense of it all, but it really resonates with me that there are tremendous gifts to be given.
Yes, thank you. These are the stories that need to be told. And what you have said, it kind of prompts a couple of thoughts for me that I would like to share. One is, the question, have you written this story down?
I've preached it a number of times, different churches since then.
Yeah, good. So after, it's pretty commonplace for LGBT people to be widely accepted and embraced in churches, and churches are learning from the lives of LGBT people, etc. There will come a day when there's another kind of question that I don't know what it'll be, but a question that will be divisive, a question that will be about the embodiment of the human difference. And we must have this sort of reservoir of stories that we have collected and pooled together so that we can draw on the wisdom of our past to propel us into the future of a kind of community that we are called to become. It's this whole Barry thing about drawing on our experience. And when I go to churches to talk about this with churches who are sort of in the process of discernment, my strategy is never to ask, to go in and start asking about what the Bible says and getting clear on all your theological beliefs, but it's the kind of question like, why does this make sense for your congregation to ask this question? Where is this coming from? And inevitably, there are stories about the past in that congregation where they made other kinds of bold stands or asked other kinds of questions about embodiments of human difference that led them into the becoming of the kind of community they felt called to become. But for some reason, we don't often think about we don't think about our communities narratively like this in love situations. So I appreciate that you have the story and you've preached the story. And I would encourage you to make sure it's written down and maybe at some point published and shared somewhere for other churches to draw upon. The second thought that this prompts for me is it really just crashes this whole notion that the next generation will be the one to save us from our homophobia, heterosexism, bigotry, hatred, etc.
Yeah.
This is not true. Not only is it not true because the statistics suggest that about 49% of LGBT hate crimes are perpetrated by young people, like 30 and under. today. And while hate crime violence has decreased a good bit in recent years, in 2012, I believe it was the highest number of hate crime murders ever recorded since these things have been recorded. And half of the instances are young people perpetrating these crimes.